listening to Voices of IFES, where we speak with people from around the IFES Fellowship about all things student ministry.
Hello and welcome to Voices of IFES. For those of you that don't know, IFES is split in 11 regions, and today we're focusing on an island within the South Pacific region. We're welcoming Joel Atwood, National Director of GNYF, the movement in Vanuatu. Hello, Joel.
Hi, Mava.
So can you talk to me a little bit about yourself in a few words?
Okay, I'm Joel, together with my wife, Tiff, and our three boys. We've been working with GNYF, the Goodness University Fellowship, the student movement here in Vanuatu for 8 years.
I didn't know it meant that. I was going to ask you. So could you talk to me a little bit about how you landed working with IFES movements? So I hear that you have an Australian accent. So tell me a little bit more.
Yeah, so I grew up in Australia and grew up in churches, but it was the student ministry I got involved in Australia that was a revelation for me. Meeting people my age who cared about Jesus too was really important, and that group at my university really shaped me in evangelism and discipleship and community and thinking about what the gospel means for the whole world outside of Australia. So I was with that group in Australia that I ended up going on a short-term trip to Vanuatu, a country I'd never heard of. In fact, I'd never been overseas, so it just felt like a grand adventure. And the year after that, as I was in leadership with the Australian group again, some people I'd met in Vanuatu asked if anybody in Australia wanted to try and start something with the students here. It's a very small tertiary population in Vanuatu, but some church leaders thought it was an important area that they were struggling to do anything with. And I asked around, and then with all the wisdom of a 20-year-old, I thought I could try. And so in 2008, I spent the year here working with some students, getting something going, and then moved back to Australia until 2015 and worked with the Australian movement. During that time, met and married Tiff, my wife. And when we started thinking about serving God outside of Australia, we ended up back in Vanuatu for the last 8 years.
So can you tell me a little bit more about Vanuatu? So what's the religious context in Vanuatu?
So Vanuatu is one of the sort of success stories of the modern missionary movement. It went from kind of just encountering Europeans in the late 1700s to having its first sort of Protestant missionaries in the sort of mid 1800s to being almost entirely church by the mid 20th century. It just grew very, very fast over the islands. And so on paper, we're something like 82% Christian and about sort of 70% broadly Protestant from that. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. Many of the students I've worked with, grown up in churches, it's an expected part of life. But some of my leaders have shared about how they think the church and their local community have become so sort of intertwined that sometimes you can grow up in church your whole life and be fully convinced that just because you're Melanesian, you're Islander, you're a Christian, but have never really wrestled with the Bible or who Jesus really is in the gospel. And so you end up with lots of people in churches who have a strong belief, but aren't really sure who Jesus is or how we can know him for certain through his word. And with that comes lots of the older spiritual beliefs that kind of have persisted, that have just kind of woven into church life and around church life as well.
Do they speak English or do they have a local language? And do you speak this local language?
We're a pretty multilingual country. There's about 115 languages amongst maybe 300,000 people. So lots of small languages. Officially, we're trilingual. We have English, French, and then Bislama, which is a Creole language, sort of similar to Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, Tulpisin. And we do most of our ministry in Bislama. That's our sort of everyday language. But in our Bible studies, we often end up using texts in all three languages because depending on which schooling system you went through, you're more comfortable reading French or reading English texts. And so we end up with these sort of Bible study tables full of different language texts. It's good fun.
Crazy. It must be so confusing.
Most of the time, it actually helps clarify things because you work out pretty quickly what the tricky bits of the passage are when the translations are very different. And often, one will do a better job of one bit of the verse and one will do a better job of the other bit, and you can together work it out. But yeah, it's great fun.
So most average people speak about like 3 or 4 languages, like a local language and the Creole and French and English.
Most people would have some capacity in 4 or 5 languages. So you'll grow up speaking Bislama, the sort of language of everyday stuff. You grow up speaking your mum and your dad's village language to some extent. And then you'll either go through a French or an English school and have some capacity with that. And then usually a little bit of the other one that you didn't go through. So
are you able to have a lot of resources in French and English for like the Bibles and books?
Yeah, yes and no. It's hard to get hold of because we're a long way from everywhere. And even though people go through French or English school systems, it's a bit variable as to how much they are comfortable with long written texts. So even if you can get hold of a book, it's not necessarily the place where people will read a whole book to think about a question. And so we often use a lot of oral methods too in our groups, even in the universities, to get people talking about passages, listening to passages, and not just sort of written comprehension. It's just not a place where that happens. Yeah.
And do you speak French?
I'm working on it. My 2 older boys are in a French school, so yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Petit peu.
Could you tell me a little bit how's ministry like in Vanuatu with all the context that you've been telling me, and how you compare it to what you've known growing up?
In many ways, Vanuatu is a really easy place for any kind of Christian ministry. You read the stories of the early workers here, and it was all being afraid of being speared or eaten by cannibals for sharing the gospel. But now, because Melanesian kind of means Christian for a lot of people, and you grow up in church, you're exposed to songs and verses and ideas and words from the Bible, people are pretty happy to have you around and doing Christian things and talk to you about God. And so in that sense, there's none of the resistance that we get in Australia towards the very idea of Christianity, which is now a bit of a nasty word. What we do get here is because there's an identification as Christian, but often not kind of a great deal of deep knowledge of Jesus and grace and the sort of very heart of the gospel. It means there's kind of this passive resistance where if you're already a Christian, in inverted commas, because of the place you grew up, why would you need to think more about Jesus? Why would you have to change your life because of Jesus? And so if you raise questions or you try and kind of probe around a little bit around people's actual beliefs, we find you often get a bit of kickback, a bit of pushback, because it raises lots of uncomfortable questions you might already be asking yourself deep down, but don't really want to confront, about whether you do actually know God, whether you do actually trust him, whether you are actually saved. And so it's quite easy to be a Christian worker, but we found it's pretty slow going to get people to engage with the gospel in a deep way.
How do you make the movement known? How do you make it grow?
Slowly is the only way we found. Is we try and move slowly and carefully and thoroughly with people, with our students. We're not trying to rush anybody. We actually want them to take their time in growing, how to listen to the Bible carefully, how to think about Jesus and who he is and what he means for us. And so because student ministry is relatively new to the islands, that also means we've done a lot with church leaders, trying to meet them, trying to get to know them, trying to support them in different ways. So I'm involved in preaching training here and a Bible college, and different ways we can serve the local church for the sake of supporting the local church, but also because it builds the trust for people to make space for their younger folk to be involved in what we're trying to do on campuses. And so in the end, like everything in our part of the world, relationships are what matter. And so we've just tried to build really solid relationships of trust with people. And that actually opens the door for them to ask the questions they really want to ask, face the assumptions or the mistruths they might be holding on to, and actually come together with us to hear about Jesus from the Bible.
So how do they perceive a student movement? Do they perceive it as concurrent competition against their churches, like you're going to steal their people?
Yeah, the instant reaction is always a fear in churches because everyone's afraid of losing their young people. There's a very strong awareness that newer generations are not as deeply connected with church communities as they have been in the past. They're struggling to hold them into the youth groups as they currently are, things like that. And so everyone's terrified of losing their young people. And so when they hear about anything new, they assume we're another church trying to just snaffle up their youth and at the expense of the existing churches. And so that's where we've tried to move really slowly and make sure the churches understand that we're not a church, that in fact we're wanting to work really deeply with this very small community for this very short period of time. And we pray, ground them so wonderfully in the gospel that they end up as passionate and equipped servants of Christ back in their churches once they've graduated.
And so how many groups do you have and how many people do you have in?
Yeah, this is a hard year to ask that question because we're very small at the moment. But we've got 3 campus groups: one international, one for international students at our regional university (USP), one for local students there, and then one at the education campus of the national university. We've got 2 more groups in the works. But the tertiary scene in Vanuatu is changing all the time, and so campuses are shutting and opening, and so there's we're playing catch up with a lot of that.
I had a question in my head. Oh yeah, do you have people working with you, or you're the only one?
It's just me at the moment. We had a graduate come on as a trainee in 2019, a boy from the Solomon Islands, also called Joel, who worked with us for a year as trainee staff, and that was wonderful. He helped us do a lot that year, and then next year we've actually got some other Australians coming over to work with the movement too.
Thank you for that. And could you share with me 1 or 2 encouraging testimonies that really mark your ministry since you've been in Vanuatu?
Yeah, I'll share one from our international work with regional students. Our sister movement in the Solomon Islands, a country just to our north, is flourishing at the moment. It's growing so fast. And we're really glad that heading that up is Eddie, who's the director of the Solomon Islands movement. And he was one of our students and one of our leaders here in Vanuatu in 2018 and 2019. He was sent here to study law. And while he was pretty quiet when we had him, it turns out he was soaking up all the training and teaching, and now he's just powering on, leading the solo movement through this huge period of growth. So God was really kind to gift us Eddie years ago, and we rejoice that his time with us has been part of how the Lord's been preparing him for his work now. Our local ministry, like I said, has really struggled the last few years for lots of different reasons. And so the fact it's small but it's surviving is testimony to God's grace too. And we're slowly in our education campus, the final year students there have really found their feet as disciples and as leaders of others. And so we're very sad to see them go at the end of this year, but we're praying that God will continue to work in and through them as they graduate.
So because you're in South Pacific, you started the year in January, right?
That's right.
So what's the plan for the rest of the year? Do you have like evangelism, outreach plan things, events?
Yeah. So our second semester, which starts in about a week's time, is our big outward push for this year. We're getting our students ready to read John's Gospel with their friends and classmates, using kind of our adapted version of the Uncover resources that IFES might be familiar with. And excitingly, we've had a bunch of churches and youth groups and high school ministries want to join us doing that. And so we're actually getting John's Gospel read all around our capital, all around at the island we're on, Efate. And so we're praying that the gospel of the risen Jesus will just flood Efate over the next 2 months and might open some people's eyes to who Jesus really is. It's very exciting.
Yeah, very exciting. How can we support you in prayers and financially?
Sure. Financially, we have pretty low overheads. We're supported by some very generous friends and churches in Australia. But if you'd like to think about funding some of our trainee staff in the years to come, or if you want to come to the beautiful tropics for a few years to help out, we can talk. But yeah, please pray for us. We're small and we're never going to get very big. There's only about 2,000 tertiary students in the whole country, spread out over 7 campuses. But God loves small things, and we want our graduates to go out loving Christ in their hearts, serving him with their hands, and ready to talk about him in every context they find themselves, the little villages of Vanuatu and the big international law things they end up involved in. So please do pray for our students, for our graduates, that the little things would grow in the right way.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Joel. And I hope you've enjoyed this podcast episode. And I hope you will think about Joel's ministry and pray for new workers and new students that are wanting to join and wanting to hear about Jesus and understand truly who he is. Thank you for joining us, Joel.
Thanks, Bava.
Thanks for listening to Voices of IFES. Follow us on your favourite podcast platform to hear more interviews like this one today. If you want to hear stories of how students are transforming their campuses around the world, subscribe to Prayer Line, our weekly newsletter with inspiring stories to help you pray for student movements. You can go to ifesworld.org to subscribe or follow us on Instagram and Facebook to listen to stories in audio form.